Greetings viewers, two quick videos on the latest edition of Uplink, which covers the topic of Brexit, why Britain has decided to leave the European Union, and an issue that was actually occasioned not by anything to do with Europe, but by the moment of history that we're all living in right now. The whole world is dealing with the catastrophe of COVID-19, and like any natural disaster, it's mediated by social history and histories of empire. And I had to write this particular piece and hold off on some other issues because the story of Brexit is actually one of the great cautionary fables of our time. And by looking carefully at it, we can start to think in a more constructive way about some of the other great disasters bearing down upon us. What makes a disaster is not the toxicity of the epidemic or the severity of the tidal wave. It's the social response that human beings have to whatever is causing the damage and problems. And so the story of Brexit is a self-destruction story, the story of a society that has failed to deal with history and is paying this terrible price. Now, I won't summarize the article, but what I will say is this article will cover sort of three main points, and we're going to look at the article covers the history of basically post-1945 Britain, 1945 to the present, as three separate eras. For this video, we'll focus just on that first era, about 1945 to roughly 1973, the most hopeful period, where it seemed like Britain was dealing with some of its issues, but in reality was not dealing with the issues effectively. Next video, we'll talk about the next two periods, the mid-period of the 70s and then the contemporary era. So just as a brief resume, one of the great paradoxes to understand about British culture and the way that it's influenced the world and still has this enormous presence in our media, in the landscape of the mass media and in the cultural imagination of the world, is that Britain is the site of a really unique contradiction. Britain was the empire of the world between 1815 and 1914. So it had a century of hegemony. It really did control the world's politics, economics, societies. Everything under the world was more or less subject to some degree of British control or constraint. Out of that came an imperial society with immense power, but also immense corruption, due to the excessive power and all this power and wealth was concentrated in one society, and of course this did bad things to British culture. It created all of these works of art and all this complexity, but also created and fostered incredible violence to the rest of the planet. One of the paradoxes to understand about the post-1945 period is this. Out of all the countries that had to give up their empires after 1945, Britain was in one of the most unique positions of all. Smaller empires, Belgium, Netherlands, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and so forth, they had to give up their empires more or less readily in the course of the world wars or afterwards, but they never ran the show. Britain had run the show. So for Britain to give up its empire was actually a double problem. First of all, it had run the world for 100 years, but then between 1914 and 1945, it had fought and won 2 world wars to sort of retain its primacy. And you can actually stop and think of this as there's a very paradoxical result here. What these world wars do is that they kind of slow down decolonization inside Britain. In other words, Britain doesn't change that much. The rest of the world changes enormously between 1914 and 1945. Britain changes the least. It's actually the place where there's the most continuity because it starts with this world empire, it ends with a world empire. The only problem is the 2 world wars exhaust it economically, and then the United States emerges as a superpower. And so in 1945, Britain has this very strange experience. It seems to have won the world wars. It seems to be still the top empire. And then the Americans show up and say, knock, 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 time to give up your empire. Because we're not paying for you to reconquer India. No, we're not going to do that anymore. And Britain doesn't have the funds to maintain its empire. So in a strange kind of way, Britain is the biggest empire of the last 150 years, but it's also the biggest loser. It has to give everything up. This contradiction led to a deep structural schizophrenia in post-war British society. So between 1945 and 1973, Britain gives up almost all of its empire. A few residual places like Hong Kong, they're still there, but for the most part, they have to give up basically 1/4 of the land surface of the earth, and about 1 in 5 human beings were ruled by the British Empire. They get their independence and fight for their own polities. where does that leave Britain and British culture? So what I talk about in the article is Britain does something which the other colonies don't do. The other empires, they go in a different direction, but they don't do what the British do. The British double down on culture, and they do so in a very specific wave. It's what I call this period between 1945 and 1973. I call it the British wave. This is the classic era of all the fantastic cultural exports that are enormously popular in the rest of the world. And they're still big franchises today, and yet they're this sort of this once-in-a-lifetime dynamism to British society. It's taking all these things from America, it's reinventing them, and then repackaging them as British, and then selling that to the world as the new, basically post-imperial Britain. You see this everywhere. You think of film culture, where you have someone like Alfred Hitchcock lending a very British sensibility to these Hollywood forms of the detective thriller and the espionage thriller and the adventure movie. Think of David Lean, the great costume epics of the 1960s, Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago. So the British film culture is sort of at its peak. Think of music, the incredible dominance of British pop music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who. It goes on and on and on and on. And then later in the early 70s, Britain largely invents the heavy metal genre and punk rock and many other genres. So there's this enormous creativity in popular music, in film culture. Think of the cultural impact of the Bond films. Nothing is more indicative of Britain trying to be an empire of culture versus an empire of military bases or commerce than the James Bond spectaculars. They take the form of the American adventure thriller espionage genre, and then they reinvent it as something uniquely British. They star Sean Connery. They kind of spread that very strange British identity and package it and then sell that to the world as a very successful story. Now here's the problem with all of these cultural works. They don't fundamentally change Britain's problem, which is for 100 years they run the world, and then for 30 years they fight 2 world wars to make sure the world doesn't change. So for 130 years, Britain is the least dynamic society on the planet. And its elites just want history to stop, to lock it down. They want to put a giant time lock on history. And it can't work and it fails. What that means is Britain doesn't get it. Between 1945 and 1973, Britain, its culture changes and adopts what are largely American forms and reinvents its media culture. But the underlying structures of British trade, industry, commerce, development, the social relations of power inside of Britain change very, very little. There's an enormous stasis, and that leads to an immense crisis because British capitalism is not competitive without this huge empire, without all these monopolies, without this unfettered access to this enormous market where it could stay number one. Britain's not competitive against the post-war capitalisms, let alone the Americans, and it starts to lose market share, and the economic crisis deepens and deepens and deepens. And that's the economic crisis that results, of course, in the rupture period of the 70s, and then later the post-79 period, which begins with Thatcherism and then turns into something else. So we'll get to those two in just a second.